Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and today I wanted to respond to a couple comments on my video. What was it called? Let me look here. It was called Casual Chat, Gender, Transsexuality, Psychoanalysis, What is a Woman? It was sort of a response to the Matt something. Matt Walsh. It was a sort of response to his documentary, What is a Woman, and the sort of prevalence of that question. But someone responded on that video with a couple of comments. They obviously have a different perspective than me. They're sort of critical, but they're very respectful and civil, and I think they're very good comments, and I really appreciate them. And I wanted to take some time to respond to them because they're good comments. They raise good questions. They're things we should talk about. I'll go ahead and read them for you real quick from my screen over here. Can you see me? I don't know if you can see me. If I get over here, sorry, I'm working on my new technology. I feel like no one is forgetting what you're saying in this video, that everyone has a mother who has XX chromosomes and a womb and a vagina, but people talking about these issues are battling for policies for the good of existing people, whether or not they will or will not give birth. I feel like people do acknowledge the limits of the real, but that they try to craft a new language to cut through it. Maybe the creative license is emerging from a God complex, but it's also taking into account human history and pain. Maybe the psychoanalytical way of thinking has caused more harm than good. Okay, there are, quote, two species of human. That's what I had said, basically. But what if we use 50 words to navigate between these two polar opposites? What would be so wrong about that? Does it have to be a negation of the real as a whole? And on a purely clinical perspective, is considering transsexuals as psychotics really helpful? Did it work in the past? What were the effects of life on life of actually living people? So I think that these are good questions. And yeah, this person wants to foreground the actual impact on individual human beings and whether or not we're being kind and charitable and compassionate, whether or not we're ultimately helping people or hurting people, which is, maybe a particularly important consideration to have when you're talking about something like psychoanalysis. So these are good questions. These are good comments, and I wanted to address them here. Anyway, so I'll start. Me personally, I'd like to distinguish between what's true and what's helpful, and then again, actually, from between what's helpful and what's good or what feels good. Ultimately, I'm devoted to what's true. I'm a philosophical supremacist, as Michael Millerman has said. I want to address things accurately as possible. And then I hope ultimately that the pursuit of truth in this manner will generate the good, will generate good outcomes, and will be helpful, and will be ultimately sort of the most compassionate avenue to take in terms of the effects of that pursuit. Maybe psychoanalysis has caused more harm than good. I'm actually really open to that perspective. I have videos sort of on this topic. I'm definitely open to it as an argument. Because I have criticisms of the sort of therapeutic state, the therapeutic view, the way a kind of managerial therapeutics has been incorporated into the particular kind of surveillance regime that we have now. I talked about that in my last video. So I'm definitely open to the view that psychoanalysis has had a even primarily deleterious effect on society and on people's lives. I'm not totally opposed to that at all. But again, I'm interested in what's true. And so, you could ask the question of what is psychoanalysis for, right? That's kind of a fundamental question that you could ask. And you can give different answers to that question. I studied psychoanalytic theory, right? I'm not a clinician. I never practiced or anything like that. I did study with people who were clinicians. But my orientation is theoretical, right? I know things about clinical practice, but my orientation is theoretical. And so for me, the goal of studying psychoanalysis, is to understand the world, to understand human beings, that's my goal. I want to use it as a lens to make the world, to make human experience intelligible, and to grasp it in kind of as accurate a way as possible. That's what I want to do. That's not everything that one can do with psychoanalysis. Obviously, there are people who think that it, and I think the proliferation into other forms of psychotherapeutics, say, I think is indicative of, more of a kind of clinical orientation. I think psychoanalysis today tends to be more theoretically involved. People tend to be more interested theoretically. Whereas when you're talking about something like cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever, they're specifically interested in clinical outcomes, I think, to a much greater degree. A lot of psychoanalysis still sort of, underrides what's going on in sort of these other domains. They're, obviously founded upon, psychoanalysis historically. But yeah, their orientation is more clinical. Interestingly, psychoanalysis empirically has superior long-term outcomes to these other forms of psychotherapeutics, which has a lot to do with it, in my mind, the fact that psychoanalysis has a much more accurate comprehension of what a human being is. That's why it doesn't run into these problems like we saw recently with, what was it? There was a big meta-analysis. I don't know who published it, but it basically, confirmed we have no idea why antidepressants would work. We don't know, how depression works chemically. We don't know what's going on. We don't know why they would work, etc. And they don't work really long term. None of these, in my mind, sort of psychopharmaceutical interventions really work a long time, unless maybe you're talking about something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or something like that. Things that are what we would call, psychoses, which leads into the current conversation. But yeah, I'm more interested in the theoretical. I'm more interested in it sort of for philosophical reasons, right? Yeah, and on this particular question, I think that the psychoanalytic understanding of gender, of transgender phenomena, is really just true. It's accurate, and so that's why I would espouse it, right? The person asked about clinical success and the effects on people's lives. I tried to get a little bit into looking at case studies here, and you basically can't. What case studies you might point to kind of provisionally in the past, let's say, well, I'll backtrack a little bit. I think in that video, I don't know, I didn't rewatch it, but I think in that video I probably said, initially, my thesis was going to be on transgender analysis, basically. And I went through PepWeb, which is the database of psychoanalytic articles that are published. And I looked into this issue and I noticed that you get to, I don't know what it was exactly, like 1978 or whatever it is. I don't know. And it was always transgenderism or transsexualism, as was more commonly talked about then, was always referred to as a psychosis. Freud thought it was a form of psychosis. Lacan thinks it's a form of psychosis. And then all of a sudden in the literature, it's univocal, this is a form of psychosis. All of a sudden in the literature, it switched and it became the ubiquitous opinion, the universal opinion, that it should be depathologized, that it's, sort of part of the normal spectrum of sexual identity and things like that. It just sort of switched on a dime. I couldn't identify at that time any particular argument or article or anything like that was just like, totally rebutted sort of the Freudo-Lacanian perspective or anything like that. It just switched. My perspective is that it switched as a result of sort of activism, a general sort of transformation in the body politic and the way they viewed these things. That basically it was a matter of politics and politics, activism, sort of invading psychoanalysis. which, you also see lots of stuff like people start talking about how we should abandon so-called Freudian neutrality. And again, I can understand an argument like this. Like traditionally, psychoanalysis sort of has the view of there's an individual, they're experiencing psychic distress, right? They have psychopathological anxiety, and they're miserable. There's society, all these norms and expectations and roles they're supposed to fulfill, et cetera, et cetera. And what we need to do is help this person to fit into society with sort of a minimal amount of repression, with a minimal amount of anxiety, whatever, right? And Freud's sort of pessimistic. He talks about how the goal of psychoanalysis isn't really a cure, say, or the elimination of anxiety. It's taking people who are, what does he say, like pathologically unhappy and turning that into normal human misery or something like that. But the idea was you take a person and you try to help them fit into society, right? And so, in some sense, like the people who are critical of Freudian neutrality would say Freudian analysis was not actually neutral. It just took the side of society, right? It took the side of the repressive institutions and agencies and other people and the norms of your particular historical moment and whatever, right? Which has some relationship to another thing this person is saying, which is it possible that psychoanalysis has done more harm than good? It used to be a fairly common argument, actually, that Freud and psychoanalysis were inherently conservative. And so people on the left would make this argument that, in fact, psychoanalysis was conservative, Freud was conservative, and so they were bad and basically should be dispensed with, right? The Frankfurt School, they try to synthesize, in some sense, Freud with Marx, some of them, et cetera, et cetera. This is all another discussion to be had. But the point is that, a lot of people have made the argument that psychoanalysis has hurt people, that it's been bad, it's been a reactionary institution, etc. I think that psychoanalysis is inherently conservative and that's good. So in the dismissal of Freudian neutrality, the argument they're making is that psychoanalysis was not actually neutral. It took the side of society. They're right. I think that neutrality is impossible. So I think their criticism is correct, which is often the case. I think people on the left have good criticisms. They have a good, there's like a particular phraseology, like a negative aptitude or something like that. They have a great sort of negative aptitude. And so in the wake of this transformation, in this critique of Freudian neutrality, they decided, actually, we can't be neutral. What we should do is take the side of the patient. And so whereas psychoanalysis used to be about take an individual who's miserably neurotic or whatever and help them to reduce their misery by conforming to social standards and things like that in a better way with less repression, right? Something like that. Now we're going to take the patient and affirm them and support them and help them to give them tools or whatever to be who they feel like they are inside. Society be damned. Society's wrong. They take the side of the patient, right? I think that's terrible. That's horribly wrong. Psychoanalysis should not be doing that. But that is the nature of the transformation that's taken place. My point is, you have a lot of transformation within psychoanalysis. There's like it used to be one thing, it becomes another. And sort of this moment of transition is, I think, basically the same moment at which it goes from saying transsexualism is a psychosis to saying transsexuals are good. Actually, the binary that society has, the idea of gendered performances or whatever society has are wrong and they're repressive and whatever, and we should help individuals to be who they truly are, not to fit into these norms and roles, but to be able to express themselves in a way that more conforms to who they are authentically within society, even though society has these society is pathological, right? I think basically that moment is the same. But the point is, so if you're looking at if you look for case studies prior to this transformation, about, so I took this seriously, right? I was like, okay, well, are there case studies? If you look at case studies of trans people prior to this transformation, when this previous paradigm is in place, say, it doesn't seem to be the case that you have a lot more therapeutic failure, right? That the outcomes are worse or something like that, and that now they're good. It's not possible, as far as I can tell, to look at case studies and figure something like that out. It kind of seems like, insofar as you can point to famous case studies that relate in some way to gender or gendered fantasies or something like that, so like the Schreiber case that Freud has, or anything like that, it doesn't very well conform to the phenomenon that we're talking about when we talk about transgender and things like that. And it wasn't viewed in the same way, obviously, by Freud or anything like that. And so you can't find like a bunch of case studies of people that we would call transgender today who are in analysis and then they have terrible outcomes and they, whatever. So you can't really compare them. There's no way to really look at case studies to confirm or disconfirm the idea that the previous model was helpful or unhelpful. So unfortunately, this question can't really be resolved in that way. But I do feel like it can be resolved. So what did I want to talk about next? I think I would just jump in starting at the beginning now and try to sort of explain more the psychoanalytical model, the idea of psychosis here, why it's being called psychosis. So this person said, I don't think it's true that everyone, people, or they said, I think everyone knows that everyone came from a woman and XX. I don't think that's true, actually. I think it's an unknown known. I mean, people know it, obviously. But they don't know that they know it, if you're familiar with this sort of schema. Zizek uses this schema quite a bit. It comes from, I think, Donald Rumsfeld. Either Donald Rumsfeld or Dick Cheney or somebody like that. But yeah, I think it's an unknown known. I think that people don't really think well about it. If you paid attention to it, I think that it would be important in the current discussion. Because the symbolic order is not a spontaneous creation of an individual human being's mind. Lacan says, for example, the unconscious is the language of the other. It's inherited. We speak the language of the other, right? Heidegger talks about this too in terms of like language speaks us rather than we speak language or something like that. So we sort of inherit a conceptual vocabulary of something like a woman. We inherit an idea of a woman, a picture of a woman. And that idea for everyone who has ever lived is the mother, right? I think basically the concept of the mother and the concept of the woman and the concept of the man, they're founded on the sort of prior concepts of the mother and the father. And these are obviously deep because every individual person who has ever lived had, a genetic contribution from an XY and a genetic contribution from an XX. Right? Everyone had, in some sense, a mother and a father. Human beings have been split into these two camps forever. The two camps have to join in order to create a person. And so everyone, when they think of a woman, right, they think of their mother, right? And so, yeah, you could talk all you want about, what all a woman could be, what all a woman could do. Can a woman have a penis, blah, blah, blah. Well, everyone's sort of archetypal example of a woman does not have a penis and will never have a penis, right? At least not at the time of their birth or something like that. When we start talking about medical stuff today, it gets complex. I think that that would be a kind of acting into nature in the way that Hannah Arendt talks about it, that it's very unwise. Like maybe we could create a situation medically in the future where human beings can just reproduce asexually or whatever. I think that would be a total transformation of what it means to be a human being so that it doesn't really bear on the present conversation. As far as human subjectivity, that's how things are, right? And yeah, the symbolic order is not something that I can just create. I can't rewrite the concept of a woman with no relationship whatsoever to motherhood. It comes from motherhood. It comes from my idea of a mother. It comes from my mother. And everyone all throughout history, it's been the same for them. And so the reproductive process, I think, that is the fundament of all existence, is therefore binary. And binarity is irrevocable, which in Lacanian terms is to say sexual difference is real. There's no escaping from the real of sexual difference. And but there's a gap, right, between the real and the symbolic in Lacanian analysis. And that's where we get this concept of a cut. And so what is meant by a cut into the real when Lacan talks about it is basically the idea that our symbolizations inevitably fail at capturing the whole of the real. So sexual difference for Lacan is real, but our symbolizations of sexual difference, which you could say basically means gender, our symbolizations of sexual difference fail at some point at capturing the whole sort of breadth and depth of the phenomenon of sexual difference. There's an inevitable gap between the real and the symbolic, right? And you could say something like social change is a product of making new cuts into the real in order to get a different perspective on, to bring something out of the real, to notice something about it or whatever, to try to capture some different aspect of it. But it can never be captured totally. Which is to say the real of woman and man at some level exceed our capacity for understanding women and men. But nevertheless, the bipolar relation between these two essential types of human beings is real. We just can't know everything there is to know about it. We can't understand it fully. Somebody like Judith Butler takes up sort of these ideas. She's a kind of Lacanian, at least early on. And she wants to do something like maybe this person is suggesting with her notion of performativity. She wants to alter all of the symbolic coordinates of sexual difference. And she seems to argue that they're ultimately arbitrary, right? All of these symbolic coordinates. And she's right, obviously, to some extent, that there is an element of arbitrariness. But this is reflective of the gap, right? And you can't have the gap unless you have the real. But so, for example, we could think of men as having long hair. We could think of women as having short hair. We could rewrite the symbolic order in this way so that the gendered expressions of men and women mean something slightly different here, right? There's an element of arbitrariness and choice. We could have someone who's an XY, on the other hand, just grow their hair long and wear makeup and high heels and dresses, talk in a higher pitch, exaggerate their hips in their gait. And in so doing, what they're doing is they're performing woman as a symbolic construct, right? They're taking all of the signifiers of womanhood and dressing themselves in them so that they can signify that they are a woman, right? That's what we think about as sort of gender expression. And so they're trying to match the picture of a woman they have in their imaginary that links up with all of these signifiers. But the problem is that all of our signifiers, they're not free-floating in sort of empty space meaninglessly. They're tied into the imaginary and into the real. Most importantly here, the real. So to say, I am a woman, I know I am a woman, let's say for me, right? That would indicate a foreclosure of the real. What I would be saying is that I can signify in all these ways that I am a woman, and that's all that being a woman is. And it makes me definitively a woman, right? Which is to say, the real has been pushed away entirely, and all I have to do is wrap myself in these signifiers or re-signify within the social order, and that's all it is. That's all being a woman is, right? It's just a matter of these symbolic coordinates. What that would mean is that you've foreclosed on the real, right? Because in reality, there's a relationship between the real and the symbolic. And to try to pretend that there isn't is ultimately going to be pathological. What did I want to say after that? this issue of knowledge is important too. Like, so this idea that I'm sure about it would have to be precisely because I've closed down the gap between the real and the symbolic. Because the symbols, right, the signifiers, they cut into the real, they can't capture it totally. So if I know for sure that I am a woman, right, then what that means is that I've closed down the real, right? Because the real actually always exceeds my capacity to know, right? So Lacan will actually often talk about the psychotic as the person who knows, right? And I think that a lot of trans people are adopting this position, at least the rhetoric of the sort of the subject who knows, which is the psychotic subject. But yeah, they claim there's nothing that can exceed their comprehension or their self-conception. And that's what it means to be psychotic, right? Not, again, we're talking about the psychoanalytical theory about trans and psychosis. That is what it means to be psychotic, right? And I think that's an accurate conception of things. I don't know if you're familiar with Zizek or his commentary on this issue, which I think is good, but he talks about this quite a bit. Like, anxiety is normal. Like, men think, am I truly a man? Am I man enough, right? They go to the men's room, they see the sign on the door or whatever, and they think, am I really man enough to be in the men's room? Do I belong here? I think you can think about this even in terms of, like, men trying to hide their bodies in the locker room or whatever. Like, when I was younger, I refused to take my clothes off in the locker room after gym and stuff like that. I think that's expressive of sort of the same anxiety. Like, am I really a male? Do I really belong here, you know? And so we all have this anxiety, actually. This is normal neurotic anxiety. And it's a normal part, like you're a psychotic subject or you're a neurotic subject, right? And so we're all neurotic to some degree. We all have anxiety. We all have anxiety because the symbolic order, because of the gap, because the symbolic order doesn't seem to fit us precisely, right? And that's because it can't capture the whole of the real. And so we fret about it. We have anxiety about it. We worry about it. We try to match the social expectations, or we worry that we don't match them or whatever, right? That's normal. That's a normal psychological subject. The trans experience, on the other hand, and again, let's just, to be safe, say often, seems to consist more in a rejection of the imposition of the symbolic, right? We all experience the symbolic as an imposition. It is, right? The idea, I have an idea of a man. That idea is given to me because the unconscious is the language of the other. So it's given to me, and it has all of these standards and requirements and things like that, and I worry about if I can fit them, or should I fit them, or do I count, or whatever, right? I'm not rejecting the imposition. I'm trying to satisfy it, right? Whereas the trans experience, again, let's just say often consists more in a total rejection of the imposition at all, right? That's why it's psychotic. As in, I have been fitted under the signifier of man, and I'm not, right? The normal subject says, am I? Am I really a man? Should I count? Right? But the trans person says, no, that's wrong. I am not. I am not a man, right? I reject the symbolic order. I reject castration, right? I'm not castrated, right? I'm not a man. I'm much more than a man, right? The society, and so this leads to a breakdown in shared communication and shared norms and things like that, which gets to the harms we'll talk about in a little bit. But at least this is the claim, right? This is a claim that we commonly hear. Like, I know that I'm that's my truth, and you're trying to deny it or whatever. I don't think that that's the experience that most of these people have. It's just sort of the rhetoric that's used. And we'll get to that in a little bit, I guess, in some sense too. But and some trans people make this rejection of castration absolutely concrete with respect to their genitals, right? The genital sort of is a sign of the fact of castration, right? Because there are two different people. That means we're partial. That means we're limited. We fit into, this is, sexual difference. If I remove my genitals and I have neither a penis nor a vagina, say, or something like that, then I'm denying castration because I don't fit into one of these categories. I'm not a man, which means that I don't lack the things that a woman has that a man doesn't, or something like that, right? So they literalize this with respect to their genitals. All kinds of, all sort of sexual reassignment surgery constitutes this at some level. Some trans people, on the other hand, try to reject the binarity of sexual difference. And they'll say, I'm not a man or a woman, I'm something else, something like that. It's, again, the same thing. It's just not literalized with respect to the body. Some trans people just want to live as the other, but they don't want to have any kind of medical intervention. These are all rejections of castration at some level, right? Because they're all saying the imposition of society, of the symbolic order on me, that I have to be one of these two things, I reject, right? I can be something that contains both of them or whatever, right? I'm rejecting sexual difference. I'm some totally other thing, right? I'm not less than a man or less than, like, a man has, some things and lacks others. A woman has some things and lacks others. The trans person is essentially asserting, I lack nothing, right? And so I reject castration. I reject the symbolic order, right? I can rewrite reality as I so choose, right? It depends on me alone. And so there's no real that exceeds me, that exceeds my capacity to know or understand. There's just whatever I will, right? And that's, again, that is psychosis. The claim at some level, is correct. The symbolic order, society, our norms, our concepts, they all are an imposition. They are a limitation. Trans people reject it. They think instead, I'm omnipotent and can rewrite it. That's where the error occurs. That's where psychosis occurs. They think reality can and should conform to their will rather than them trying to conform themselves to reality. And again, this also is reflective of kind of the dispensing with Freud and the idea of like the reality principle. Which is to say, I think in some sense, our society and our cultural discourse itself has become psychotic to some extent. And that the left is psychotic, sort of in essence, to some extent. Because it doesn't. Reality does not conform to your will, despite whatever attempts of human beings to make it do so. And that's because something like sexual difference is real, right? It isn't purely symbolic. It isn't capricious. It isn't arbitrary. The ways that we conceptualize it are limited, right? But they're not capricious and arbitrary because they're tethered into something that is firmly within the real, right? Which I'm trying to get at when I talk about the fact that all of us come from a mother and a father. But the denial of this fact, I think, invariably leads to what is called the return of the repressed, which is to say symptoms. Because anytime you try to deny something that is real, it returns with a vengeance, right? That's sort of the idea. And it returns with a vengeance to create symptoms, to create psychopathology. Where's my mouse? Oh, there it is. So part of the problem here, if I remember correctly, I think the figures now are like 25% of trans teens identify as LGBTQ plus now, right? Something like that. And that's an enormous number. And so I suspect that most of these cases, like there are people who want to call them like social contagion or something like that. I think that's sort of beside the point. Because something is being tapped into here. There's a reason for this kind of identification, whether or not you think it's a fad or something like that. Fads have meaning. So the question would be, what is the meaning of this increasingly widespread identification with sort of the trans spectrum of identities or whatever you might want to call them? And I think that what's going on is basically something like the normal human anxiety we were talking about for more or less healthy subjects a way out is being offered, right? A cheat, a hack, an escape is being offered through the culture of the present moment to people, which, teens are particularly susceptible. Like I said, when I was younger, I wouldn't go into a locker room like this. Today, I wouldn't care. That's because teens in particular, that period of your life, you're particularly anxious about whether or not I count as a man and what's going on with my body and things like that, right? And so I think a way out of this anxiety is being offered to them through the trans movement. People, in short, are sort of being promised that they can escape from normal human neuroticism through LGBTQ identification. And again, I think that's an absolutely false claim, right? I care about the truth. Like I said at the beginning, I think this claim is false. It's a snake oil, and it's wildly unpopular. But the reality is that you cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape castration. The real will always exceed your ability to render it intelligible through signifierization. And the anxiety stems from this gap between the real and the symbolic. It's a matter of castration. And no castration from a Lacanian perspective, which I think is correct, would mean no subjectivity. You just don't become a human subject when you reject castration, right? And so this kind of escapism, I think, is sort of de facto pathological. It's not psychologically healthy. It's bound to lead to certain mental issues, which is enough, I think, to want to reject the ideology, even if our concern is only at the level of individuals' well-being. But on top of that fact, it's also connected to a whole kind of apparatus of medical intervention, which I think makes it particularly dangerous. Interventions which are often permanent, which are, again, ultimately life-destroying. I'm just thinking of it now, but it's interesting. There's another form of kind of concrete castration being introduced here to mirror the symbolic castration in the form of the chemical castration with these hormones and puberty blockers and stuff. So we've got the physical castration of the genitals, chemical castration through sort of hormone therapy, and the symbolic castration at the level of being introduced to language and having to fall under semantic categories, right? And with all their limitations. So there's these kind of three different kinds of castration going on, which is interesting. But this means that a lot of people are having their lives destroyed. They're going to have their lives destroyed by medical interventions motivated by a totally inaccurate conception of the world and of human beings, albeit maybe motivated, as you're suggesting, by a kind of humanistic compassion, right? I could grant that, but it's wrong and it's misplaced. But that's the clinical case as far as I can tell. Like, if you want to think about individual human beings and the effect on their psychological well-being. So does the new view cause harm? I think yes, it causes a tremendous amount of harm. And you can see that, I think, in the fact that trans suicide rates are very high. As you probably know, this even applies post-transition, surgical or otherwise. And so, I mean, if you jack the rate of trans identification way up, you're going to lead to more suicides, right? That seems to be the case. And, I mean, you might try to argue that 25% of people in 1950 or something were also on this sort of spectrum. I think you'd have an extremely difficult time trying to make that case. So yeah, we seem to be maybe kind of even causing a suicide epidemic here. It doesn't really get more clinically disastrous than that. You could say, well, were trans patients all killing themselves in 1950? Maybe so. I haven't seen any indication of that. But okay, to escape from the level of individual impact here, we can also think more broadly about society and the culture in general. And that's where I think the effects are particularly pernicious. And I basically think that's destroying the world, right? That is totally destroying our culture and our society. And that's because this view that we're talking about is not limited to psychoanalysis, although, again, I think it can be sort of historically traced specifically within psychoanalysis. but it's pretty mainstream in the culture now. It's part of the official agitprop of the governing institutions. And what is the effect, I think? I think it's observable all over the place. I think it's observable everywhere, essentially. I think sexual difference is the most fundamental, important thing, period. But you can see it, I think, in the disordered relations between men and women. And the rejection of sexual difference entails there's no difference between men and women. And this, with sort of a longer trajectory than just the trans issue, I think is responsible for the breakdown in marriage, for the proliferation of fatherless child rearing, even things like workplace stress and the creation of things like MGTOW and the production of incels and the hookup culture that victimizes, I think, men and women to a great degree. I don't know if you saw recently, but we now have the highest suicide rate in the history of our country. And I think this is directly related to the issues we're discussing here. Again, if you think especially more broadly about the sort of assault on the real of sexual difference than just trans identification or transgender people. But yeah, I think we could go on and on about the problems with this kind of stuff. But suffice it to say, I think this is a really big issue. It's causing really big issues. And yeah, those issues were not present in the previous conception of trans phenomena as a form of psychosis, right? We didn't have these terribly disordered relationships, I think, between men and women. We still had intact, functional families and households, and we didn't have the kind of suicide rate that we have now. And I think that our culture, was just better, was more vital, vibrant, that we were doing better as a society, basically, on every front. The people were doing better. Education worked better. Everything did. And I think it all relates to these issues. But I hope that addresses your comments pretty well. I just wanted to say a few things about it and address it because I really appreciate them. I think they're good comments. And this is important stuff to think about and talk about. I think that I addressed everything that I wanted to. In any case, remember, don't simply react, but think culture.